Hello everybody. This video is to help you prepare for our next session on building a high-performing team. So this is going to provide you with a backdrop on what teams entail, the pitfalls that teams can experience, and some of the processes that you need to think about in building a high-performing team as a manager in an organization. So we're going to start with the idea of when you need a team versus when you need a group. You need a team, for one, when you're looking at jointly produced efforts. If you just need a group, then you may well be able to, for example, go to individuals on your own, gain their collective wisdom, and then move along and solve the problem on your own. A team is needed under several conditions, one of which is you need to produce interdependent work that relies on the expertise of others. Now, teams are becoming more and more pervasive. Organizations are much flatter than they used to be in the 80s and 90s. Organizations got a bit clunky, they had too much management, and therefore the organizations shed those middle management layers, and now they're a lot flatter. And that means that people are taking on more varied responsibilities versus having these very strict, bounded rules and ladders of advancement. So self-managed work teams are really the wave of the future. Now, to give you an example of a high-performing team with some degree of dysfunction, if you've ever seen the show, is based on the TV show called House. House, the gentleman with the cane sitting on the gurney, is a diagnostician, world-renowned, who basically, when people get very sick and no one can figure out what's wrong with them, he is the person they go to, and he and his team diagnose what's wrong with them. Now, undisputedly, he is the expert, but he arguably wouldn't be able to solve a lot of these on his own. He needs other smart people around him with whom he can disagree, who might have ideas of their own, and he can build on those to ultimately figure out what is wrong with these folks. So if you watch the show, somebody comes in and the guess will be he has a certain problem, and then they will tease out all the symptoms, think about the root causes, and it takes the entire show to figure out really what's going on with this person. So you need teams, number one, when there's no clear answer to a problem, and therefore you need to rely on the wisdom of a team. When the task is complex, because we are boundedly rational human beings, we only have so much ability to specialize in a particular area. So we rely on others around us to help us complete tasks and coordinate those activities. We're boundedly rational and bounded in terms of the time that we can allocate to things. When creative ideas are needed, because very often the team can outperform the individual. When the problem crosses function, so the classic type of team is a cross-functional team where individuals from different functional areas of an organization come together, as would be the case if, for example, an organization were tasked with developing a new product line. When everybody's buy-in is needed, the decision requires broad and deep support in order for it to be implemented successfully. So let me give you an example of one in my school, the McCall School. We have teams of people this semester who are looking at the undergraduate and graduate curriculum, and those teams are varied. There would not be it was very intentional to get people from different disciplines on those teams. So, as one example, I'm on the undergraduate committee, and I'm the only management person, and my colleagues in marketing, in economics, and elsewhere in the building are with me. And the reason being that if one person buys in from management, the likelihood is that we would have similar interests, and therefore everybody would buy in. And more generally, the idea that everybody has been represented, and therefore it's got to have been a better discussion, and therefore more worthy of consideration when changes come through. Just so you know, the optimal size of a team is 6 to 8 people, the right people for that task at hand. So there's actually a really good article out on how if you go higher than 8 people, you've got to be very conscious of that. 9 can be a problem for the purposes of social loafing and for the purpose of complications in coordinating activity. Okay, so what I wanted you to realize is this. If you look on the right-hand side, what you really want from a team is synergy. That is when the team outperforms the best of any individuals. Okay, that is what synergy looks like. When no matter how good the individual's individual efforts are, if you put them all together to solve that same problem, the team will do better. On the flip side, we know that there are a lot of team traps and dysfunctions of teams. So, this idea that, oh, well, you put a lot of smart people together and who are all motivated to do the same thing, that it's going to work out is a misclaim. And in fact, lots of great smart teams, motivated teams of individuals have still performed poorly. To give you an example of one that's used, and a real world example that's used very often to highlight a dysfunction, the NASA Challenger explosion was afterward. A presidential commission was conducted to evaluate why the Challenger exploded, this national tragedy. And for those who might remember, there was a teacher that was going to be on board, Krista McAuliffe, and the presidential commission uncovered the fact that part of the problem, beyond the technical side, was that the NASA group experienced what's called groupthink. And that is when the pressures toward conformity of thought are so strong that they override, appraisal of alternatives that should be considered. So the idea here is this: NASA had been planning to launch the Challenger for months prior to the actual fateful launch, and the weather was bad. There were other reasons for the delay. So NASA was getting all of this negative public press, and it in general was planning to launch. So NASA didn't want to get egg on its face by delaying again. And the night before the launch, some of the subcontractor engineers, the subcontractor was a company called Morton Thiokol, they had data to suggest that it was way too cold to launch that day. And if they did, the O ring on the rocket booster was going to fail. And so these engineers came in and said, "Hey, look at this data." And NASA said, "No, we don't buy into the data. We don't believe you," even though it was fairly compelling, and they just ignored it and scapegoated these gentlemen. And then they all decided to launch, and lo and behold, they should not have, and the Challenger blew up. So, and many teams can have this happen. For example, on a highly cohesive team where you believe so much in the goodness of the team and the quote righteousness of the team, then whenever somebody comes up with an idea, everybody else just goes along with it. Great idea, and maybe it's for the cohesion of the team. You don't want unnecessary conflict, but we talked about on day one that conflict is needed. You must have some degree of conflict on tasks if you're going to do well. So on one hand, you've got synergy, which is what you want on teams, and then on the other hand, you've got a dysfunctional team. And the key to determining whether a team is synergistic or dysfunctional is how the team interacts, the team process in the middle. So as a manager, you have to realize that these team processes matter very much to the health of a team and ultimately its success. And we do know that the early life of a team has a dramatic impact on the late life of a team. So, for example, the cultural norms of any group get solidified very quickly. If you have a team and you show up and two people out of those six aren't prepared, and the team moves forward and doesn't talk about it or give any negative consequences, you may well find that the next time around, three people show up and they're unprepared. And it's just that fast, the signaling. So norms happen very quickly, so a manager must be aware of those. Okay, so team decision making the right way. These are the primary steps for making decisions on a team. Identify and explore the problem, generate possible solutions, refine and critique solutions, and implement one. Now, this seems like a piece of cake, but very often people fail to even figure out what the problem is. So, as an example, there's a company named FireArt where it was experiencing a dramatic decline in sales. And so a external consultant was hired to work in conjunction with the senior VPs in that company, and they were asked to identify a solution, how to fix this issue of declining sales. Well, it turns out that the way the consultant interacted with the senior VPs is that he would have them create presentations with their solutions, but they never did a diagnostic around what was causing the declining sales in the first place. Was it the quality of the product, in which case it was really a manufacturing problem? Was it poor marketing on the part of the salespeople, in which case that was a different problem? So, what was it? Before they could figure out how to solve it, they needed to really figure out what's the root cause, because you go around and you decide that it's marketing, so you're going to hire 5 new people, and if the product is shoddy, it doesn't matter in the first place. In a more personal issue, we have in the McCall School decided to close off our executive MBA program, and there was a concerted effort, excuse me, to identify why the executive MBA enrollment was declining. And there were a lot of different thoughts on that. Some people thought that it was really a marketing problem, that we just hadn't thrown enough marketing dollars at it. Other people thought, maybe it's the curriculum and that we have to be more creative in the way that we design and deliver programs. So the way you identify the problem has a big impact. Then you generate possible solutions. And this is one thing that you need to realize again as a manager, which is there is a tendency on teams to pick out 1 or 2 solutions that work and go with those. And if the people who've come up with those possible solutions are very, quote, popular, experts, politically strong figures, then it may well be that you stop at 1 or 2 solutions rather than consider more like 5 or 6. So you have to be very conscious of generating possible solutions. You then refine and critique them, and that may take time. It's not necessarily a matter of minor tweaks. If you want to persuade people in an organization to impact or to affect a solution, it's going to take time. And you have to hear the concerns of various constituencies, make changes, come back to them, if you really want that broad-based support. And then you would go ahead and implement a solution. Now, some of the things that you're looking for are, we'll start at the bottom, the norms and accepted behaviors. You've got to watch that as a manager. How is the team interacting? Are people coming prepared? Are they engaging in conflict? Is it that certain individuals talk and other people don't? What is the power structure embedded in that culture? So you've got to watch, how does that culture evolve over time, and is it the right culture that you need to solve the problem? Conflict, we talked about how you need conflict in moderation, which is around tasks. And lastly, you need a broad-based participation. If you have a few people who are dominating the conversation, you really are not maximizing the potential of that team. At the same time, you need to make sure experts talk when their expert opinion is needed. Okay, so in terms of organizational traps, groupthink is one of them, and a couple of others. A number others include the idea of authority, that people have a tendency to defer to authority, and that could be from a cross-cultural perspective in power-distant countries. When I was in Japan teaching in our Boston University's international management program, the younger South Korean gentlemen, they were all gentlemen, ended up deferring significantly to the older Korean gentlemen on their team. And it was a cross-cultural matter. The expectation was that they would defer to the more seniors' expertise. Now, you could argue, is that really a downside? That could be a cross-cultural issue. You have to just watch for it and realize that in some teams across the world, people may defer. The key is just, do you then have the right people? If you know in Korea that you need a lot of more dissent or discussion and open discussion and dialogue, then maybe you need people of at equal levels in the organization versus having junior people who will probably, from a cross-cultural perspective, defer. More generally, we know people defer to authority. The famous Milgram studies that were conducted several decades ago, a gentleman named Stanley Milgram was trying to understand why the Holocaust happened. All these people were complicit and or participated in the killings of 6 million Jewish individuals. So he said, why did this happen? And he conducted some studies wherein And there was a teacher and a learner and a person in a research lab coat. So there was a researcher overseeing this study. And the teacher was intended to ask questions of the learner. They were in separate rooms, and the teacher was told that the learner was strapped into a chair that would administer electrical shocks if he mostly, got the answers to the questions wrong. So, for example, they're in separate rooms. The teacher asks the learner a question. If he gets it right, nothing happens. But if he gets it wrong, the researcher, who's in a lab coat, a white lab coat, who's an authority figure, says, I'd like you to administer a shock to the body of the learner in the other room. And each time the learner in the other room, who was strapped to this machine with voltage on him, each time he got the answer wrong, the voltage would be increased. And what the study showed was that these people who were the teachers and asked to administer shocks to the body of the learner in the other room, most of the time didn't want to do it. But because there was an authority figure in the room telling them to do it, they actually did it. And they were willing to go to a very high voltage, even though they could hear people in the other room yelling and screaming. Now, it turns out it was a big hoax. That study never would have been able to be conducted today because it would be a breach of ethics. But back then, it was very telling that when told to do something, people will very often defer to that authority. Now, peer pressures, people we know succumb to peer pressure, and more generally, they conform. We are social animals. We will conform to the norms. It reminds me of the movie Dead Poets Society when Robin Williams' character as the teacher had people walk around in whatever it was, the courtyard, the students, and they immediately, when they started walking, he asked them to walk, and they started walking in unison and started to sort of chant together. So there's a tendency to just fit in and follow the norms of other people. Now, or excuse me, the behaviors of other people. The challenge is that means when we need to maximize diversity of thought on teams, we very often don't get it, and people are unwittingly involved in these pressures. So, in terms of what you do about it, let me start at the bottom. Bosses can excuse themselves. JFK was known to actually excuse himself from discussions in order to maximize the diversity of thought in the room and for people not to defer to him. Get outside counsel. If a team is succumbing to groupthink, wherein everybody inside the team is experiencing this conformity of thought, the idea is to get outside counsel. So you infuse the group with new ideas. And by the way, we know from studies on senior management teams that the more diverse outward facing contacts the people on the senior management team have, the better the organization does financially, which is kind of crazy. And the idea being that those people, the outward facing networks allow those management teams disparate ideas and differences of opinion that they need to help the teams function. Demand multiple alternatives. So, say you're in a meeting as a manager and you have two good ideas. You say, okay, these two work. Let's come up with three more, even if they're just variants of the first two. Devil's advocate. Yes, you can assign a devil's advocate. What's known now to be more effective is that you actually have somebody who disagrees with the premise of what you're doing come in and act as a devil's advocate. The idea being, if you identify a devil's advocate who really doesn't disagree, he or she will have a very forced devil's advocate perspective. So this is a reason to get involve the people who disagree with you as you're working on a team. And just more generally, ensure diversity of thought. Make sure you're very careful about who you put on teams, that they're not yes people, that you have a lot of differences in perspective on those teams. Okay. One reason that you'll be doing the Strengths Finder discussion is this idea of what's called a congruent appraisal. So, in any situation, we come in which we have an identity, and we want other people to agree with how we see ourselves, both in terms of our strengths and our weaknesses. So if you see yourself, if you appraise yourself as strong in a certain area, you want people to validate that from you in teams. So as an example, if you were came from investment banking, wherein you've been trained, you have a great financial background, and you've been trained in investment banking, you would see yourself as having a strong financial acumen. So if you were on a team, you would want A, to convey that so people could see you in the manner in which you see yourself, but also because when it comes time to create some of these financial analyses, you would want most likely to be included in that. So just think, a lot of the conflict that occurs on teams is when people fail to see each other the way they want to be seen. And that can cause problems. So if you see yourself as a marketing expert and somebody else, when the time comes to ask for marketing input, never ask for your opinion, you will probably have a rift between you. Now, on teams where everybody's strengths are acknowledged and roles are assigned to people based on those presumed strengths, the team performs better, there's stronger commitment, greater loyalty, and motivation. Hence, why I ask you to share your strengths with your team so you can start to get a sense of who is good at what, how does he or she see himself, herself, and how can we leverage those strengths. Now, in terms of more recent research on great teams, here's what I would say about this. I don't find the findings on this to be amazingly different than what you would expect, but nonetheless, it validates something very important you need to look for as managers of teams. So, there was a study done at MIT where people were given these like sensors that allowed the researchers to figure out when people were talking, the way that they were facing, their body language, how often they communicated. And so they were trying to figure out levels of communication, diversity of communication within the subgroups. And what they found was, if you want a strong team, say you've got 6 people, you need to see a lot of, quote, energy from that team. You need to see a lot of people talking at different points in time so that the overall communication between them is significant. If you have a team where people say, oh, we haven't really been getting together very much, so we've only had 2 meetings where we might have had like 6, it's probably not a very good team, because you do need a lot of communication on teams to be effective. Now, engagement. This is how teams interact. Oh, and let me go back because I added some people. So the outcome you're looking for number 1 is that on a team of 3, Bob, Jorge, and Nancy all talk a lot. Now, engagement. This is how the team members interact. What you're looking for here is you don't want subgroups or cliques, and you want equal participation with equal members. So, and by that I mean this. You don't want Bob to interact 90% of the time with Jorge unless it's absolutely needed. You need Bob to interact significantly both with Jorge and Nancy, because otherwise you're missing out on the communication, the coordination, the bonding that's built. And it doesn't mean that Bob needs to always pull Nancy in on the discussions, but it means that, for example, she needs to be in the know in terms of what's going on. So if you've got sub-cliques and people are only interacting in their cliques, you've got a problem. So on your own teams, how much communication are you getting? Are you talking a lot and enough? And I will tell you, at the end of the semester, if you have 1 meeting to discuss your project, you're probably going to find that it really wasn't enough, that the energy alone was too low to be effective. But if you have, say, 2, 3 meetings, they're of a decent length, everybody's prepared, everybody's talking a lot, and they're looking around the room at each other as they're interacting, and then communicating via email with follow-up to everybody, you're going to be a lot better off. Now, exploration is the last piece of this, which is the degree to which a team explores beyond its boundaries. Here, you're looking for the team to go outside of itself for information. And the idea being that if you look at, say, a marketing function in an organization, that could be considered a team. Do the people in the marketing function have ties to people in strong ties in other parts of the company that they share ideas with? And if there's a lot of sharing of outside the boundaries of the marketing team, you're going to find that you're a lot better off. That fits with that study on senior management team, wherein you don't get the insular perspectives if you go outside. If you go outside and have context outside of it. So in sum, you need to talk a lot. Everybody needs to be talking with each other roughly equally, and the team needs to be able to go outside of itself to explore beyond its boundaries. Now, a great team player in this article is found to be somebody who engages in short, high energy conversations with everybody. So it doesn't mean that the great team player has to interact with a lot of people at length or while it's not there, that he or she doesn't have to engage in long conversations. And more generally, think about it in an organization. If you look around, people can who can be seen as team players. You don't necessarily talk to them at length, but they feel very good. It's an energetic conversation, and they are very succinct in their communication to you, and then they move on. I'm going to show you the learning objectives for class so that you understand where you're going with this. One of which is you're going to explore the implications of the subarctic survival activity. So you're going to start by watching the debrief with the experts, hearing how he or she scored it. Well, we'll say he, it's a he. And then the team will score its success. And then you'll talk about why did you do it? What are the implications of that? You're going to start then to build your in-class leadership team using the self-assessments, that is the MBTI and the Strengths Finder, and a discussion of expectations as an opportunity to get to know each other and move beyond that early stage of a team. Wherein, as we talked about last time, you're in the forming stage where people aren't as motivated for the team, they're motivated for themselves as individuals. And so you help people bond and create that motivation and figure out who should play what role and how to communicate effectively at a time early on in a class like this one. So you'll talk about your strengths as a leader using Strengths Finder, and you'll talk about the implications for the MBTI and you for building teams. So as an example, you'll share your top 3 strengths from Strengths Finder. You'll add any particular strengths that you possess that are relevant to teams, like you may be a good paper editor, you enjoy giving presentations, you'll discuss an area for improvement that you're working on in your career, and you'll optionally use the group Strengths Finder Excel spreadsheet to figure out, well, where are our strengths as a team? The Excel spreadsheet, which I'll post for you or have posted, shows that there are 4 primary sets of skills that a team needs to be effective. So you have to try and figure out where is a composite of our skills, so that you could figure out where people may need to pick up and provide roles that are not necessarily naturally present. At the top, you'll discuss expectations for working together, and you'll share your MBTI types, the strength of your preferences, and that in part is to help you just better learn about yourself, how you behave and how other people behave on on the basis of their MBTIs. You'll create a team composite where you write out everybody's and the strength of theirs, and you'll talk about what are some of the challenges that we might experience in light of our team composite. So if you have only extroverts, you may miss the shrewd introvert who has something to say and has been really thinking about what's going on, whereas the extroverts may be very busy thinking about their own contributions while others are talking. So you'll discuss all those things for you for working together. And the goal of the night is to really start to understand these assessments for your strengths, your weaknesses as an individual, because if you're going to be effective in your career, you have to be able to manage yourself. And in addition, to start to build a high performing team so that throughout the semester you experience that and that you turn in stellar final projects.